Okay, this is part 6, the Synagogue of Satan, Footprints in History. I just wanted to correct something from part 5. I had said that Bar Kokhba led the revolt from 66 to 73 AD, but that was incorrect. He actually led a revolt decades later than that, so sorry for the error. I just want to go over the revolt that started in 66 AD in Judea in a little more detail to shed more light on the sects that emerged from that at that time and later. And it seems that there was a spirit of rebellion that swept the whole Roman Empire, not just Judea and Jerusalem. There was a civil war in Rome in 69 AD, 68, 69 AD, and it had begun, the movement had begun a little earlier. The Senate in Rome was displeased with Nero, and they were afraid that he was taking too much power. And they seemed to spread a spirit of revolt across the empire, even all the way to Jerusalem, to subvert Nero and his power. In Judea and Israel, there were tensions between the Jews and Romans and Greeks and others, leading up to killings, and it eventually led to the Romans going into Jerusalem and the temple and taking money out of the treasury, claiming it was for the emperor, and that actually set off the full revolt. And it led to the point where the Jews eventually took over Jerusalem, and Herod Agrippa actually left Jerusalem, and the Romans were kicked out also, and a revolutionary government of the Jews was set up in Jerusalem. But there was a lot of division among the Jews in Jerusalem and across Israel, so that things broke down into sects and factions, and it appears that there were cults of personality and different ideas, and there was no unison on how to deal with the Romans. One side wanted to oppose the Romans with physical force, and the other side wanted to work with the Romans. That was the basic dividing line. The upper classes and Sadducees were mostly on one side. They wanted to work with the Romans, and on the other side was the Zealots. They wanted to kick the Romans completely out of the country. And there were also personalities that complicated things. They arose across the country and in Jerusalem, and they had questionable motives, and it appears they were just seeking their own power. But there were rumors that the upper classes were conspiring with the Romans, so the Zealots, out of fear, actually brought in the Edomites. They allowed them into the city, and the Zealots and Edomites ended up massacring a lot of commoners in the city. So the Romans hadn't even done anything, and there was already a lot of death in the city. And the Zealots took over the temple complex and ended up ruling most of the city. And when the Romans finally besieged it, the Zealots took over and pretty much forced a fight with the Romans. They actually would burn food so that the people inside the city were forced to fight. The Christians appeared to have left Jerusalem years earlier. There's a story that they had received a miraculous message from God to leave the city. And there's debate in history whether the Christians were actually part of the Zealots and whether it was true that they had received any message. But it appears that they had left and gone to Pella across the Jordan in the Decapolis. This is said to have angered the Zealots, and this might have been one rift between the Christians and the Jews at this time. There was a lot of death and destruction in Jerusalem. The Romans finally entered the city, and much of Jerusalem was destroyed with the walls, and the temple, of course, was burned down. And I said before that it may have been actually a mob that destroyed the temple. The Roman order actually didn't want the temple destroyed. The Christians didn't necessarily want Jerusalem destroyed or the temple, but there was a common belief among the Christians that the destruction was actually revenge on the Jews for killing Jesus, who they believed to be the Messiah. Vespasian and his son Titus ran the campaign for the Romans in Judea and Jerusalem. There's evidence that they looted the temple, but again, they probably didn't want to destroy it. The Roman Empire was receiving a good cut from temples across the empire. They didn't want to change their religions, they just wanted their cut. The temples would receive a lot of income through taxes, contributions, donations, even the redemption of slaves in the temples. There's evidence that Vespasian, when he became emperor of Rome, used treasures from the temple to fund the building of the Colosseum in Rome. And it's also believed that at first Vespasian and Titus were not proud of their victory over the Jews, believing it was just the forsaking of their God and the chaos that gave them the victory. But later, Titus would use the victory over the Jews as propaganda to help him secure his position as emperor. According to the historian Tacitus, about 600,000 people died in the siege of Jerusalem. According to Josephus, it was about 1 million. But it's believed that most of the survivors were sold into slavery across the Roman Empire. About 50 years later, there was another revolt of Jews across the Roman Empire, and another revolt in 132 AD under Bar Kokhba that lasted about 3 years until it was put down. And it's believed that the rift between Jews and Christians was complete about this time. But according to the Bible, there was a rift between Jews and Christians much earlier, at the time of the apostles, long before the destruction of Jerusalem. It's also believed that the Jewish dispersion began about this time, but Jews were already widely dispersed, going as far back as the Greek empires and into the Roman Empire. With the destruction of the temple, the rabbis came into prominence, and the synagogues became much more important. And by now, the Christians were barred from the synagogues. Many different sects arose, and some would be called Jews, some would be called Christians or Jewish Christians, and they had differing beliefs, and they had different philosophies. Some borrowed from the Greeks and other cultures, and there was a different emphasis on certain beliefs and customs. I would say that the main difference between the Jews and the Christians was whether Gentiles, when they converted to the Jewish religion, had to also keep the law and the customs of the Jews. It's clear in the Bible that the Christians resolved that the Gentiles did not have to keep all of the laws and customs of the Jews. The Jews could have converts, but to be Jewish you had to comply to the law and all the customs. With Christians, you could, if you were a Jewish Christian, you would still keep the law and the customs, but converted Gentiles did not have to. The Christians had been considered Jews by the Romans, but eventually something turned the Romans against the Christians, and the Christians were no longer viewed as Jews and were considered a new sect, and they would come under more and more persecution as time went on. The Jews could still be exempted from serving in the Roman army, and they could observe the Sabbath and observe their religion and still keep their legal status as Roman citizens in the empire. But the Jewish Christians, who considered themselves to be the true Jews, lost their legal status, and they came under increasing persecution for not acknowledging the Caesars as gods. Now you can see in all these revolts that they only seem to just increase the power of the elites and the ruling classes, and you might wonder if they actually had a scheme to cause the revolts only to give them more power, and somehow the revolts would begin in the shadowy underground of the elite. And you can see a spirit of rebellion that somehow seemed to lift up its head. And the prophet Jeremiah had a name that he gave to Babylon. The name is only used one time in the Bible. That's Merathaim, and it means double rebellion. And that's the word Merath, which is rebellion, and then the Aim is the plural of that, or doubling of that. And you can almost see the name Mithra in that again, I'll just say. And so in all this, you can just see the spirit of rebellion at work. Now it's interesting that after this time, the Sadducee sect and also the Essenes seem to disappear. The Essenes, that had been the forerunner of monasticism, they would reappear in the monasteries later. Then there appeared more and more sects and factions with differing beliefs and with charismatic leaders, and it was not clear just exactly what they believed and whether they were Jews or Christians or Jewish Christians or pagans. After the Bar Kokhba revolt, the Jews were banned from Jerusalem and most of Palestine, but the Rabbi Yonan ben Zakkai got permission from Vespasian to found a Judaic school at Yamnia or Yavne on the coast of Palestine. Since the rabbis benefited from the change after the revolts, you might wonder if they had a hand in bringing it about and had desired the change. But the Jewish Christians, many of them would flee into the wilderness as far as Arabia. The center of the main Christian movement shifted to Antioch and then to Ephesus and finally Rome. I'll name a few of the important sects and go over some of the things that they believed. There were the teachings of Marcion, the Ebionites, Harpocrates, Carinthus, the Elkasites, the Hermeticists, the Mandeans, and the Sabians. Gnosticism also emerged, but there's no agreement as to just exactly what Gnosticism was, or where and when it originated, and whether or not it could be compatible with Christianity or with the Jews or with other sects. Eventually the Christian church emerged with more and more defined doctrines and with more clear limits on what was heresy and what was orthodox belief. So I'll continue in the next part with a closer look at the different sects and with the growth of the Christian church and the controversies between the different sects and also between the Jews and the Christians. So I'll see you then.